This video is brought to you by Wix. What's up guys, Jared again. As I'm sure many of you are aware, there's been a lot of talk about a certain kind of fan who worships characters that, well, shouldn't be worshipped. The most obvious of these is perhaps Rick Sanchez. Now before you murder me, I'm not saying Rick isn't an amazing character, because he is. But even Dan Harmon has said, in the face of people screaming at minimum wage workers at McDonald's, that the people who see Rick as a role model are missing the point. So like all things, I asked why? Why do people worship Rick Sanchez? Love him or hate him, Rick is objectively an asshole, and the show goes out of its way to tell us we don't want to be him. And it's not just him. There are tons of amazing characters who, for lack of a better word, are assholes, and scores of people who look at them and say, that's who I want to be. Tony Montana, Walter White, Frank Castle, and of course, Senor Sanchez. So what's going on here? Are we so wrapped up in the badassery of Heisenberg and the Punisher that we're ignoring the messages the shows are giving us? Well, to answer that, we're gonna have to go back in time to study the assholes that started it all. Welcome to this Wisecrack edition on assholes, the fictional kind. And yeah, spoilers for Rick and Morty, Breaking Bad, and The Punisher ahead. But before we get to it, want to give a shout out to our sponsors over at Wix. It's about that time of year when thousands of students are graduating and heading out into the real world. And whether you're on the hunt for your first job or an internship, the best way to stand out as an exceptional candidate is with a website. With Wix, you can create a personalized professional portfolio to showcase your work. With advanced design features, an easy-to-use editor, and industry-leading SEO optimization, Wix gives you the tools you need to put your best foot forward. I made my own website with Wix and was pretty surprised with how much fun I had doing it. Plus, I now have something to showcase what I've been doing, whether it's voiceover work, writing projects, or anything else. Right now, you can get started for free by going to wix.com/wisecrack or clicking the link in the description. And now, back to the show. To understand the likes of Tony Montana or Rick Sanchez, we need to go back to the literary archetype that created them, the tragic hero. Tragic heroes in Greek drama are protagonists with a critical flaw that leads to their inevitable downfall. In other words, they were usually assholes. Those characters, along with other forms of drama, served a specific purpose: education. Imagine, it's Athens, 4th century BCE, and you're letting it all hang in a toga and generally having a pretty good time. That is, unless you're a woman, slave, foreigner, or Socrates, in which case you're kinda screwed. Except there's only one problem in your fancy Greek life. There aren't any schools as we know them today. See, before the rise of the sophist, the Greek model of education revolved primarily around rich kids being independently educated by a host of random teachers and older male role models. Essentially, take your average trust fund kid of today, but instead of all the lawyers, therapists, and personal trainers, they've got their writing instructors and their mythology teachers. As a consequence of all this, education wasn't the prerogative of any one institution, but rather of society as a whole. In ancient Greece, and in particular ancient Athens, the village raises the child, or as the poet Simonides said, the polis teaches the man. So if education is handled by the city but there are no schools, how do you tackle educating the male populace en masse? Through storytelling. Enter the Dionysia, essentially Athens' version of South by Southwest. During the week-long Dionysia, Athenians would spend all day watching multiple tragedies and comedies before voting on which one they liked best. But these plays were more than just the ancient equivalent of films in the park. They were like mini moral sermons. Characters in Greek theater weren't meant to be realistic representations of everyday people. The actors wore stylized masks, and the characters themselves had larger-than-life aspirations and flaws, often lifted straight from mythology. This was done to imbue the characters with a greater, almost symbolic purpose. As best stated by the OG of literary theory, Aristotle, character in a play is that which reveals the moral purpose of the agent. In other words, character was the vehicle for the moral of the story. And true to form, both ancient tragedies and comedies focused on the consequences of its characters' moral choices. And that's where our asshole characters originate from. It pretty much breaks down like this. In tragedies, our assholes are heroes who couldn't overcome their central moral flaw and as a result, met a pretty horrible fate, usually a coffin. Obsessed with gaining knowledge? Well, your quest might just lead you to banging your mom and plucking your eyes out like an Oedipus Rex. Meanwhile, in comedy, our assholes actually learn from their flaws and get a pretty sweet deal, usually a wedding. Obsessed with going to war? Well, your womenfolk might decide to barricade themselves in the Acropolis and stop putting out unless you change your ways, like in Lysistrata. In essence, tragedy and comedy were two sides of the same coin. If you're an asshole, either succumb to your flaws and be punished, or overcome them and be rewarded. While there are always exceptions, this has pretty much been the go-to rubric for entertainment for the last 2,000 years. Assholes are punished for being assholes, or rewarded for changing. In the process, we're handed a fairly obvious moral lesson. Don't be like these guys. And this basic formula persists, even in shows like Rick and Morty. But our reception of these moral messages may have changed. For example, let's look at Rick's Season 3 arc. By the end of Episode 1, Rick seems to have gotten everything he wanted. After the conclusion of the first episode, there's no Intergalactic Federation, no Citadel of Ricks, no Jerry, no problem.
No problem!
But Rick's fatal flaw is the very intelligence that let him do all these things in the first place, and he's punished for it.
You are the master of your universe, and yet you are dripping with rat blood and feces.
The rest of Dr. Wong's monologue reads like a literary analysis of his tragic flaw.
Rick, the only connection between your unquestionable intelligence and the sickness destroying your family is that everyone in your family, you included, use intelligence to justify sickness. You seem to alternate between viewing your own mind as an unstoppable force and as an inescapable curse.
This is all in stark contrast to Jerry, whose stupidity lets him find joy in everything, even a low-grade simulation. And by the end of Season 3, we see Beth, Summer, and Morty choose Jerry over Rick for this exact reason.
Yeah, you win, Jerry. You win! No amount of genius can stop your dumb, mediocre, vacuous roots from digging into everything and everyone around you and draining them of any ability to fend you off.
In the end, Rick's intelligence made him, in his words, the lowest rung of his idiot family, but that hasn't stopped some fans from being so unapologetically pro-Rick, and by extension pro-asshole, that Dan Harmon pondered to GQ magazine, "Do I worry about them ruining everything? Yeah, I do." Likewise, in Breaking Bad, we see our main hero suffer from his inability to overcome his central flaw, pride. In the show, chemistry teacher Walter White turns to making meth with his former student so he can pay his hospital bills and take care of his family. After building up a multi-million-dollar empire over 5 seasons though, Walter has to square with the fact that the very pride that drove him to achieve all this is also his biggest problem.
I did it for me. I liked it. I was good at it.
In the end, Walter is punished for this pride, and he loses the two things he started the series trying to protect: his life and his family. As Walter Jr. powerfully tells him on the phone in the penultimate episode,
"You asshole! Why are you still alive? Why don't you just die already? Just die!"
And yeah, Walter does die in the end, but not before a torrent of fans took to social media and called out every character who betrayed him, including Aaron Paul, the actor who played Jesse. Fans were so in Walter's corner that they started calling Aaron a f***ing rat in person, which is pretty messed up when you consider that Walter poisoned his girlfriend's 10-year-old son. Likewise, the Punisher, decidedly an anti-hero, becomes the same monster he's been fighting against. After he finds out his whole family had been killed in an orchestrated hit, Frank Castle becomes a one-man death squad. But this single-minded approach comes at a severe cost. Aside from dealing with a heaping dose of PTSD, Frank's insistence on literally taking heads almost perverts the very justice he's striving for. As his ally in Season 1, Micro, tells him,
Your family's dead. Anyone that ever looked at you sideways, they're dead, and you just keep on going, huh? You just keep on going. You're a psychopath.
Worse, Frank's violent vigilante behavior has become the inspiration for a domestic terrorist.
I guess they needed you gone. Too many people were on your side. People like me, people who know that we have to take matters into our own hands.
In the process, Frank becomes wrapped up in the same senseless violence that cost his family their lives. But again, some fans don't see how Frank isn't one you want to emulate. Even though the Punisher is a symbol of violence gone too far and an inadequate justice system, his logo has repeatedly popped up on police cars. As a result, Punisher creator Jerry Conway made this statement: "The vigilante antihero is fundamentally a critique of the justice system, an example of social failure. Whether you think the Punisher is justified or not, whether you admire his code of ethics, he is an outlaw. He is a criminal. Police should not be embracing a criminal as their symbol." So here's the question, Wisecrack. If all these asshole characters in media are getting their just desserts, then why are so many fans worshipping them anyway? Well, we put our crack team of media experts to work and we decided it comes down to two things: society and psychological realism. Back in the ancient times, the unseen force that moved people was fate with a capital F. In ancient Greece, the Fates, or Moirai, were the white-robed manifestations of destiny, and they spent their time spinning the literal thread of life. Everything that happened to these men and gods was dictated by these beings, and this is one of the main forces that tragic heroes often find themselves arrayed against. Oedipus, for example, was cast out as a baby because the oracle told King Laius that he would be murdered by his own son. Well, 20 years and one dead father later, Oedipus discovers that the prophecy had indeed come true. And hint, it's because of his tragic flaw, his undying quest for knowledge. Oedipus becomes the king of Thebes after solving the Sphinx's riddle, only to use that same intelligence to later discover his unholy union with his mother that ends in her suicide and him stabbing his eyes out. And this tradition of fate moving our heroes carried on well beyond the rise and fall of ancient Athens. In Macbeth, our hero becomes a usurper due to the prophecy of 3 witches. In The Master Builder, Solness falls to his death after being wrapped up in Hilda's questionable narrative. And in Game of Thrones, Jon Snow is definitely the fulfillment of the prophecy of Azor Ahai. But something has happened in the last 100 years or so. We've moved away from the idea of gods controlling us like a bunch of Sims. Instead of our tragic heroes railing against fate, they're mostly railing against society. And that's the situation we see with a lot of our favorite asshole characters today. In Breaking Bad, Walter White isn't punished by the gods, but rather by a broken medical system that isn't giving him an out.
Sometimes I feel like I never actually make any of my own choices.
In The Punisher, Frank isn't up against the big man in the sky, but rather a corrupt US military-industrial complex and an impotent criminal justice system. Hell, even Rick isn't a victim of fate, but rather the idiots and bureaucrats that surround him.
They're not robots, Rick! It's a figure of speech, Morty. They're bureaucrats. I don't respect them.
In some way, we the audience can see society as fate itself. Walter, with no options, has no choice but to become Heisenberg. Frank, with no recourse for justice and no place in society for people who only know how to be a soldier, can only become the Punisher. But at the same time, our characters transcend their predestination. Walter cures his cancer with drug money in a way that no other science teacher could. Frank Castle delivers justice to criminals when society fails to do so, and Rick Sanchez solves all of his ills with portal guns and his super genius. The shift from fate as public enemy number 1 to society goes a long way in explaining why we're so okay with our asshole characters today, even after they've been punished. While it's easy to swallow the pill that you can't fight fate because it is by its very nature outside of your control, society isn't. Society can be changed. And if this terrible character is chafing against a system you hate, they become a symbol of the change you desire. There's no incentive to worship someone who tried to buck fate and failed because there's no beating fate, period. But to worship somebody who fought against an unjust system even though their flaws undid them, well, that makes a little bit more sense. Sure, Frank Castle's appetite for violence and revenge definitely goes too far, but it's also what allows him to stand up against an unjust system. After all, you don't need to go full conspiracy theory to wonder if the military puts its own interest over that of its soldiers and its country, or to think that veterans get a raw deal when they come home.
All I know is that we risked our lives and we did terrible things. And it meant nothing when we got home.
Similarly, you can understand why people are going to be in Walter's corner despite all the bodies piling up around him. Yes, the show goes out of its way to tell us how Walter's pride brings his downfall, but that same pride also allowed Walter to fight back against some serious BS. Unlike the drama of ancient times, the tragic flaws for these characters are the engine that allows them to overcome a broken system. They're relatable because they serve as a perverse wish fulfillment. Hey, are you being drowned in a sea of drudgery and stupidity? Well, do I have a mad scientist for you? Overqualified for your job and deep in medical debt? Well, there's a drug dealer that I think you'd like to hear about. Besides embedding a social critique in these characters, psychological realism can help us understand our attraction to them. The greater effect of replacing fate with society is that it helps close what writer John Gardner calls the psychic distance, essentially the space between the reader's thoughts and that of the characters. In ancient times, actors wore stylized masks, spoke in high-flying verse, and were up against the gods themselves. A good method for teaching, but not exactly the best way to have your audience relate. But in modern times, film and TV focus on naturalism, a one-to-one replication of reality in order to optimize relatability. Our characters on screen speak and act like us, and the problems they face are often relatable. Even Rick, once you strip away all the science fiction, comes off like your drunk, narcissistic uncle. And to an extent, that means we end up rooting for the asshole and sometimes missing the larger message. Who cares that Rick is a dangerously dysfunctional alcoholic who wakes up in a pile of his own feces, when audiences can relate to how soul-crushing it is to have all the answers and still be miserable?
Fun's fun, but who needs it?
So what do you think, Wisecrack? Has media's razor-sharp social commentary ruined the tragic hero? Or are we the assholes after all? Drop us a line in the comments, and don't forget to check out Wix to create your own professional website for free. Click the link in the description to get started, and as always, thanks for watching, guys. Peace.